Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I am delighted to welcome back Dr. Francesca Bocca. You're most welcome. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, and thank you for having me back here.
It's great to have you back. For those who don't recall, Francesca has a master's degree in neurocognitive psychology, a PhD in systematic neuroscience, both from the University of Munich in Germany, and a diploma in Islamic psychology from Cambridge Muslim College here in the UK. She has been working inside and outside academia on the issue of Muslim identity in Italy. Her latest book, The Italian Islam Manifesto, touches upon the most urgent topics facing Muslims in Italy. She's also the director of the Ibn Rushd Islamic Studies Institute, the first Italian language madrasa for children and youth. So you're doing some pioneering work there about Islam and Italy. Fantastic work you're doing. I wish you all the best for that. And today, I'm very happy to say, we're going to be talking about the European Enlightenment. What is the European Enlightenment and the birth of Orientalism, and particularly the views from the Enlightenment period about Islam, because it's quite some interesting, diverse opinions. They're not all one kind. But perhaps you could introduce it. What is the Enlightenment, first of all, from an Islamic perspective?
Yes, thank you so much, Paul, really, because you chose this topic. We had some chats about what might we talk about, and you picked up the Enlightenment, which is something I did a few years ago before focusing more on Italy. I was more focused on European Islam on a wider lens, and thank you for bringing me back to this. It's nice, and it helped me refreshing also the material I am going to talk about. So one thing I believe is really crucial if we're going to talk about the Enlightenment is to understand what is from a Muslim perspective, because the name itself can prove to be quite deceiving for Muslims, because Enlightenment has this beautiful aura, right? It talks about light, and all European languages translating it like Aufklärung or Illuminismo bring this beautiful light image to mind. Yeah. And sometimes we might think, okay, but also in Islam, like Imam Malik radiallahu anhu said, knowledge is a light. So there might be something similar between us, perhaps, but going more in depth, and I suggest for Muslims who are interested into the Enlightenment to start really, for example, from Kant, who wrote this short article, Was ist Aufklärung? What is the Enlightenment? Yeah. And from there, it's already quite clear that we're talking about different types of light. And the light of the Enlightenment is a type of light which is, if we want to keep the light metaphor, a torch which really only illuminates something very specific with the one specific type of reasoning, while leaving out what was before, namely religion or what they call superstitions. And this type of hyper-focused thought, hyper-focused analysis, and with all the positivistic then undertones it gave on science, when applied to the study of Islam, gave really birth to Orientalism. There is no other way to say it. I believe this is a direct result of it. Even though when we go to the very first text of the Enlightenment, we see that there is much less apologetics against Islam than before, compared to the Middle Ages, right? Where really the view of Islam is the worst thing ever, like only negative things were said.
You're absolutely right. It's not just, but it's not just it was worse than during the medieval period, the perceptions of Islam. It was completely based on myth and error. There was nothing about it usually that was true. You know, that Muhammad worshipped three gods. I mean, you can't exaggerate how mistaken and profoundly wrong Western perception of Islam were during the medieval period. Now, Islam had been around for centuries, so there wasn't really an excuse, but nevertheless, views were and you get the same tropes being recycled from writer to writer, from myth to myth. And it was only really with the Enlightenment that some writers began to actually attend to what Islam actually taught, what Quran actually says. But so yeah, there was quite an interesting paradigm shift from the medieval Christian period to the Enlightenment period. So maybe there was some little bit of light being shed at the Enlightenment.
Yes, and on Islam in particular, there are a few steps that I think are very significant for the understanding that the West had of our religion. And for example, if we take some of the very first texts that really represent the encyclopedic vocation of the Enlightenment, for example, the Bibliothèque Orientale of Barthélemy d'Herbelot, which was already in 1697, he speaks about Arab, Turkish, Persian sources directly, finally, but still there is a lot of Eurocentrism. I just take 2 lines from his entry for Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he says, the interpreters of the Quran and other schools of Muslim or Mohammedan law have attributed to this false prophet all the praises that Arians, Paulicians, or Paulinists and other heretics have attributed to Jesus Christ, while at the same time depriving him of divinity. And that's his entry. And we see 2 main lines here. First point is already not analyzing objectively, claiming the falsehood of this doctrine. Second point is using Western schemes to understand the Islamic phenomenon, because he says the Muslims are like this in this way, and they are like that in this other way, without adopting indigenous terminology and indigenous ways of understanding. And this is a big damage that started from that time. And there is also very important for the study of Islam. A compatriot of mine, Ludovico Marracci, was one of the first translators of the Quran into Latin. And of course, he had to translate the Quran into Latin, so he had to write an introduction in which he distanced himself quite a bit from it, because we still had the Inquisition going on, right? It's a time of contradiction, the Enlightenment. We still have the Inquisition going on, but we're breaking the shackles of religion. It's complicated. And so in his introduction to the translation of the Quran, I translate, without a doubt, that superstition contains everything that is credible and probable regarding the Christian religion and what seems to be in accordance with the laws of nature. But it completely excludes the mysteries of faith, which are considered too difficult for human nature. Therefore, modern idolaters more readily embrace Saracen law than the evangelical law. Again, the same problem in very different contexts. So we see this is really one of the first European trends in understanding Islam. While at the same time, there were some authors that did praise Islam for being more rational than Christianity, that included Islam into those Wunderkammer, these beautiful rooms, displays, and really as one of the glories of humanity, what Islam produced. And there are even some lower points. For example, Voltaire, very well-known, wrote this play about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which even Goethe judged as being such a horrible play. He refused to translate it, and in fact, he made a fake German translation. It's really interesting about that.
Wow, that's interesting. So there were different views. So the almost unanimously negative view of the medieval high Christian period, the Catholic period, and then the breaking into the so-called reason, rationality, the Enlightenment. And you mentioned Goethe there, who had a comparatively positive appreciation of the Prophet's life, and even learned some Arabic, I think, and was able to read the Quran directly to some extent. And then other people who were still very Orientalist in their perspective, you know, but bringing in their own categories rather than attending to what Islam actually says in its own terms, trying to impose an agenda on it. So, of course, Voltaire, you mentioned him, the famous dramatist, and who's much lauded today in some circles. So who were the good guys? Who are the people who really, in the Enlightenment period, attempted to understand Islam on its own terms rather than, impose on it Western Orientalist categories? Are there people we can look to as pioneers of accurate study of Islam in the West?
Yes, I would say so. And my sole example for that time would be Goethe, actually. And I'd like to say something a little bit more about his biography. And then maybe if you want, we can move on to what actually he said about Islam compared to what his contemporaries were saying. His life is really incredible because at a young age, already at 20 years old, he wrote a poem in appreciation of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he wrote in his private letters, which are still conserved in the Goethe archives, about how he exerted himself to live as a Muslim. which I think is quite significant. He learned Arabic. In his notebooks, we see the exercises he takes, and his handwriting, mashallah, improving through the decades. And it was really a deed of love that he had towards the Arabic language. And when he died, it is reported he had a Quran on his nightstand. And these are very significant facts. I have tried to collect some of these in a book, which has been translated into French. So perhaps this is more available than Italian, which is...
when was he? He was around in the 18th century, 19th century?
Yes, so he spans the second half of the 18th century, of the 17th and the 18th. So he dies 1832 after completing his the last version of the Westostlicher Divan, which is dedicated to the Quran.
Yes.
So this is really something amazing. And through his life, the way he studied and approached Islam, though, was through the encyclopedias that were published by the Enlightenment, because he did not have access to manuscript. He lived in Weimar, which was not a central city. And even though he had basically anything he wanted concerning the liberty of creation, of writing, and so on, he still suffered being a little bit away from the thinking centers of the age. So also to know Islam, he could never really find Arabic manuscripts except the Quran. And so he based himself, so he makes some mistakes in his notebooks, but he really does his best. There are some pages in which he's trying to understand, okay, so these Mu'tazilites, what are they actually saying against this Ash'ari? And he makes schemes, and he really, really exerts himself. And that was so praiseworthy at the time and incredible.
I mean, Goethe is an incredibly prominent figure in Europe. He's a poet, a writer, a supreme intellectual. He's seen as a great, great man. But you're saying in private he was actually a Muslim, and this is not widely known. I mean, it's not like everyone think, Goethe, the Muslim. We better not let our children read him then. There's no one seems to be raising any alarm. So have we turned a blind eye to what he was really about in Europe? Are we pretending perhaps we're looking at his public poetry and not really looking at his spiritual interests and commitments and in Islam? Are we pretending perhaps not to see what's really there?
Yes, I have had the opportunity of working on Goethe's personal archive for about 2 years. Wow. And in that, I've noticed that a lot of fragments that are quite explicit about his adherence to Islam, I would call it, were not published. While I think that these are incredibly enormous importance for European history. And I've tried to compile them and then make them public in a book concerning that. And also in some articles, so perhaps they're easy to find online now. But still, it hasn't catched on a lot. I believe it takes a little bit of time for this to understand. But I really am sure that a person that writes like that in his letters, in his diaries, that marks when is the beginning and the ending of Ramadan in 18th century Weimar on his diary, most probably was a Muslim.
Sorry, why Goethe? Why did he? Because he seems to be fairly unique in that respect. What is it about him that attracted him to Islam? Because this wasn't normal at that time.
Yes, it is a way, though, that was open for many people, but it seems that only he arrived to Islam through that way, and that was the way of Weltliteratur. So there was this idea that the world has a unique literary and philosophical heritage, and that a real intellectual is able to read and understand and enjoy and create through what the world, all population, all cultures have given to him. So his mentor, already when he was about 20, told him, you seem so bright, but have you tried reading the Quran? And that was how he got into it. He read it as many people today read the Veda or the Avesta, okay, I want to be a complete intellectual, so let's do this.
Well, that's what I did. One of the reasons I read the Quran years ago, before I ever studied Sharia, I thought, I've never read this book. I'm really interested in the Bible. I should read the Quran. And I remember one of my Christian friends saying, "You bought a copy of the Quran." I'm really surprised, Paul. You got a copy of the Quran. Well, why not? I want to. It's a book, one of the world's great literary works. So I thought, so maybe there's a similar motivation there.
Yes, there is a similar motivation there. And actually, as he was so young when he read it, he got into so much full enthusiasm. And then we have some letters of his friends, which are hold your horses a little bit, because he was starting writing these extra mystical poetry about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Day of Judgment imagery like Ali radiallahu anhu, and he was really, really going an incredible, interesting route. But then he toned it down a little bit, but never stopped having this interest. Rather, he kept it for private interest, not secret and private, because there's a difference. We also have, some closeted Muslims through history, and this is much harder to prove. But he actually lived like that and wrote like that. Just his published works have Islamic keys to be understood, not only the Divan. Also, the Faust has many Islamic themes, in my understanding, but not as openly as one could do nowadays, for example.
Oh, Faust! You mentioned Faust. That's the work that I've read, the only one I'm familiar with by Goethe. Absolutely central work of the European Enlightenment, of European literature. If you haven't read it, recommend you get a copy. Very easy to get a copy of Goethe's Faust, of course. So he was an extraordinary figure, and there was another figure, was it not, his almost contemporary, who in some ways was even more significant in his day, and that is Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, who I think was at the university, taught philosophy at the University of Berlin, and basically dominated European philosophy in the 19th century in ways which perhaps we find hard to understand today, because he certainly wasn't a postmodernist or anything like that. But he had quite a different view on Islam, didn't he, compared to Goethe anyway?
Yes, and I think that they are really two giant figures, and to understand the routes that Europe took entering the 19th century, it is really important to be familiar with both to a certain extent. And I think that the first difference between the two is that Hegel took away wonder from the world, while Goethe, as a poet, kept wonder and what we would call tadabbur, tafakkur, inside anything. And even if we read, for example, his theory of colors, which is a scientific work, I suggest everybody reads it, how full of wonder and praise of God that is. For Hegel, instead, the world just is a system, and so there is a philosophy of history that it is a system and can be understood. So these are two views, even more of Islam, even more just of life, of nature, of what it means to be a human, what is the most developed human even. And concerning Islam, both have spoken about very similar themes, which makes it very interesting to make a comparison between them. When one starts reading, for example, their definitions of Islam, it doesn't seem to be that different. So Hegel talks about a vollkommenes Hingeben, so a complete abandonment, while Goethe talks about unbedingte Ergebung, so an unconditional abandonment, more or less. That the English is the same, so one might think, okay, they're just trying to translate to German. But if we try to pull the aspects of Islam that they studied, they're very different. So Hegel was very little interested in the religion, because he said it's not very interesting and it's incomplete as well. But he was very interested in the historical reality of Islam. So what did Muslim kingdoms do? What do Muslim people do as a group, as a society? And there he also he took a bit from Voltaire the idea of fanatism, and he repeats that word quite a lot in his works. While Goethe's interest in Islam that we can get from his notebooks and so on is primarily the Quran. And he says that the Quran is something really unexplainable with words, and it is an eternal guide because of its action. So these are the terms that he's using. And of course, we're talking about Islam, so we talk about the Quran, but we also have to talk about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Hegel completely ignores the figure of the Prophet. And this is not only him. Many Orientalists afterwards try to explain Islam as just a series of mechanical events in history, and the Prophet is just the founder. While in Goethe, he writes openly, I never considered him an imposter. I always consider what he said to be truth, which is a shahada. So this is the written shahada of Goethe.
Yeah, no, you mentioned it. Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. Yeah, in his own day. Yeah, it's true. Yeah. Oh, by the way, I'm going to link to your article comparing Goethe's and Hegel's views on Islam, a thematic approach, which is in English, a very interesting and scholarly paper there. So you can read up some more about that. And my own favorite book on Hegel is this one by Peter Singer, who's an Australian academic professor. A very short introduction published by Oxford University Press. It's nice and thin, as you can see. It's very readable. Hegel, in my opinion, is not readable. He's difficult to understand. He obviously wrote in German, and also but he was incredibly reading Singer on Hegel. Hegel has some incredible insights, particularly about the modern world, modern consumer capitalism, for example, the nature of existence in our contemporary world. Even though he died more or less at the same time as Goethe, I think, in the first half of the 19th century, he is still a very important thinker, is what I'm trying to say, despite the fact that he's not really followed today. There aren't many Hegelians around. Of course, famously, Karl Marx kind of took over Hegel's thought and turned it upside down in some ways, and we now have Marxism, which is perhaps the most famous illegitimate child of Hegel, if you can put it that way. I don't know, but I do recommend this book. It's a great read, and it's inexpensive and not very long if you want to know more about this really important European thinker. So anyway.
Yes, and actually talking about illegitimate children of Hegel, I would like to say something before going back to this comparative approach. And it is that nowadays, and it's always been the case, since Hegel is so difficult to be read, then everybody can be a new Hegelian without having any consequences, right? And that's the same of many philosophers. I studied and loved very much Heidegger during my work, and I see many Heideggerians, and I am like, where does it relate?
Yeah, I mean, Heidegger, I know it's not talking about Heidegger, and I know what Heidegger said about Islam, but Heidegger was actually a national socialist. He wasn't forced to be a national socialist because everyone in Germany at that time. No. Before it was compulsory, he enthusiastically signed up to the Nazi Party, and he did in some of his Jewish colleagues at the university in Germany. He got them to lose their posts. And today, many people on the left, the political left, like him, he's kind of, he has some interesting thoughts about this and this. Dude, he was a Nazi. I mean, he really was. It wasn't. It really was. It's really weird how we kind of lionize these figures and ignore a lot of what their political allegiances, if they didn't really matter. But that's not how Hegel saw it. He saw his own worldview very much impregnated with that. Of course, he lived after the Second World War, and said some things about the environment and technology which are interesting, but he never repented or disowned, as far as I'm aware, anyway, his past at all. But
this is very interesting because we have many figures in Western thought, starting from the 20th century, I would say, that have incredible insights and an incredible weakness of character at the same time. Yeah. So it is very problematic to say I'm a Heideggerian, because you might, seem like a Nazi, and I don't want to look like that. Yeah. But at the same time, the Western thought is made like that. So we are able to accept, for example, Foucault and his deconstructionist methods, while at the same time, he was a horrible person. So
sorry, it's really good. Just pause on Foucault for a second. He's very fashionable, latterly in France, now in the United States, where everyone's a Foucaultian, without going. But this guy, if you look into his biography, his life, boy, did he get up to some dodgy stuff. I said boy, with young boys and other places. And, and the way his life ended and so on. But that doesn't seem to matter because he's a guy of the left. And so we don't talk about or Karl Marx, his views on race. If you look at Karl Marx's views on non-white races and Friedrich Engels, his colleague, shocking. And yet they don't seem to have any impact on the veneration given to these figures in the Western Academy, which is really odd, really. But you're absolutely right. It's not just character flaws. Some of these people did things like Foucault, which would certainly end up in jail for long prison sentences if they were prosecuted today.
Yes, and this is interesting because on the one hand, we have these types of thoughts that we might want to engage with, as Muslims. But on the other hand, we have these characters. And there is a historian that writes about Greek philosophy, Pierre Hadot, and he wrote about the beginning of Greek philosophy. And he said something very interesting, that authentic philosophy, ancient philosophy, was first of all a practice before a system of thought. Absolutely. And in the moment in which the two things stopped overlapping, we have some problematic issues. And here,
Plato particularly famously, it was about how to live one's life as a just person, a good person, one's relationship with the divine, the nature of a just society, and so on. It wasn't like for Hegel, this kind of a system of political ideologies and history. It really was what we would call today a religion in some ways. It was a deen. It wasn't just an intellectual pursuit. It was, what is it to be a good person? What is it to be just and holy and so on? And yeah, absolutely right.
Yes, and if you spend your whole life trying to understand what is being, that is the question of Heidegger, but you forget what is to be a good person, then you're not a good person because you didn't pay any attention to that. And we have to recognize this, that a part of moral philosophy has been ignored by the West in the last 200 years. And there are some very dire consequences to that, I believe.
Yeah, oh gosh. And can I just recommend a couple of other books while we're on the subject? This is
a very good
book, thank you, by John Toller. Now, he's a professor of history at the University of Nantes in France, but he's actually an American academic. This is a brilliant book, Faces of Muhammad, Western Perceptions of the Prophet of Islam from the Middle Ages to today, by Professor Toller. And it really is extraordinary. And he goes into what many prominent medieval thinkers in the West thought about Islam, which is you would not believe what they thought and taught. How they couldn't have got it more wrong if they tried. And beginning with the Enlightenment, we start seeing some light, literally, with people like Goethe, and some old tropes, recycled, people like Voltaire and others. But it's absolutely a marvelous book. There's a fantastic chapter here on Napoleon as well. He's meeting with Goethe because they actually met. And it's just a brilliant book, very sympathetic and academic and readable. So I recommend that work. And another one by a Muslim writer, this big tome here, Islam and the English Enlightenment, an untold story by Shah. So this talks about John Locke and others, and the influence of Islamic history on their thinking. John Locke, of course, had a huge influence on the American Declaration of Independence and the Founding Fathers in America. This is actually quite a thick tome. I've not finished it, but this is a very good book, Islam and the English Enlightenment. And talking about Orientalism, of course, is the great classic itself, Edward Said's Orientalism. There's so many different covers to this book. This is a particularly odd one. There's One-Eyed Woman, but I guess there's a metaphor there. We'll go there. Anyway, this is the Bible of Orientalist studies, I guess. There's Said himself, a Palestinian academic, University of Columbia, and there have been some Muslim critiques of that. While Halak, although he's not officially a Muslim, but restating Orientalism, a critique of modern knowledge, which is to some extent a critique of Edward Said's work, Orientalism. And this is absolute brilliant work by a contemporary writer who's also at Columbia University, I think, same university he was. And of course, there's other books by Wal Halak as well, which are equally worth reading. So there's some of the books I'd recommend.
Yes, you mentioned Napoleon, by the way. There is something interesting that I want to remember our public, perhaps, as the connection there, because you asked me which intellectuals try to engage with Islam. Now, if we're not talking about intellectuals, but men of action, well, Napoleon certainly tried to do it in a very unique way, declaring that he was the real Muslim, right? When he was entering Egypt. And there is very famous quotation in which he calls for the Qadi, for the Sheikh, for everybody to tell the people that we are the real Muslims. And then he arguments further, why are we the real Muslims? And he says, were we not the ones who destroyed the Pope that was waging war against Muslims for centuries? And so this is a type of very strange engagement with Islam that has happened from the French world. And the French world has a history of strange engagement with Islam, even before the whole current issues that we're seeing nowadays that I would still call strange and unsettling. But for example, Victor Hugo.
Oh, Victor Hugo, yes.
Yeah, yes. So he calls Napoleon Mahomet d'Occident, so the Western Mahomet at a certain point, which is weird. And then he goes on writing all these several poems on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which I advise people not to read because they're not good. But these poems paint this double light of Islam. And this double light of Islam is, on the one hand, facts that are accurate. So he pins down the correct year of the Hijrah, the correct city, the correct place, the names of the people. It's right, it's fine, it checks out. But then the psychological characterization is horrible. And if we think about it, that's a little bit the same of what Hegel was already doing before. Because, for example, he was saying that Islam is telling about, in his philosophy of history, quite a few accurate facts for the time about battles and dynasties and things that check out. Yeah. But then how is he characterizing them? The English translation would be fanatism, distractive revolution, and harsh service. And if we, again, go back just for a second to Goethe, the words that he uses for the history of Islam, because here now we're talking Napoleon, we're talking Hegel, we're a little bit more of the practical side of things. He talks about an advantageous fearlessness, or he talks about a joyous observance, love between the two worlds.
Wow.
And it's quite a different way of saying things.
That's right, but of course, the study of the East, of the Orient, was mingled with colonialism. You mentioned Napoleon; he didn't just proclaim himself a Muslim, arguably insincerely, but this was all to do with getting the Muslims in Egypt on his side, who he had just invaded, of course, with an army of Orientalist scholars who then did practice their Orientalist scholarship on Egyptian society. And so I don't think the Egyptians were fooled by his claims. I'm the new Muslim caliph, ho ho. But nevertheless, sorry. The study of Orientalist study of Islam wasn't just an ivory tower pursuit. It was inextricably connected to colonialism. And this is something that Edward Said speaks about a lot in his magisterial work. Do you want to say a bit about that? Why it's not Western academic studies? I mean, you could say the same today, of course. We're very much connected to conquering Muslim lands for the West's benefit, of course.
Yes, absolutely. And there is a macro shift with colonialism in which academia becomes the first servant of colonialism, in my understanding. And this is from the very beginning. So we're not talking about later authors, but already René de Chateaubriand, one of the first Enlightenment people. He says that the Arabs are like soldiers without a captain, they're citizens without a law, they're a family without a head of family, and they're an example of civilized people who then fell down to the state of savage. And actually, if you think and if you read behind the line, this comes also a bit the narrative of the Zionist movement a little bit. And this is scary that it has such old roots, because the way of understanding the Arabs as this big civilization, which then is fallen down, and now it needs help or it needs people to control them. Already René de Chateaubriand is bringing the first ideas that then the Zionist movement is using now. And this is something that as academicians, as people of thought and culture, we should make this very clear. Where are the origins of these problems? And we should eradicate them, right? So read critically these authors in schools, in university, not like take them for granted. Yeah. But this, of course, is not like Chateaubriand Zionist. There are many steps in between. For example, one very well known by the English-speaking audience as Rudyard Kipling, who during the Philippine-American War writes about the white man burden, right? And this white man burden, which is to serve, even says in the poem, to serve your captives' needs, right? To civilize those people. And he calls these people half devil and half child at a certain point in the poem.
Wow.
Which is scary because, first of all, it tells about an idea of childhood, which is primarily Western and is so alien from Islam. Because for us, children are beautiful fitra, right? They're the closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They still remember the covenant. They're amazing. If you admire a child, really, you have a better relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a certain way. While Kipling is saying, these people are scary because they look a little bit like children. And here you can really see the derangement, right, that the Enlightenment brought. And it's a derangement which is also teaching derangement. Have you ever realized how boring are Western schools? Who follows this approach, right? Okay, there are different types of rocks. This is the name of the first rock. That's this. What type of way to study nature is that? What type of way to study animals? Stripping away of wonder, stripping away all beauty, and not leaving the time to reflect and to ponder. And some people tried to do better, like Maria Montessori and the pedagogical revolution of the 20th century, but still, wonder is nowhere, and still childhood is not taken care of. And this, again, comes from the Enlightenment.
No, this reminds me in the UK context of Isaac Newton, who is credited with lots of things, just advancing optics and discovering gravity and writing Principia Mathematica, many things the greatest work of science ever. But the point is that although he was privately very committed as a Christian and had very interesting ideas about God, he was a Unitarian, publicly his understanding of the cosmos was very mechanical, completely drained of any sublimity, any sense of mystery or awe, as you say. And this brought the protests, and people in England here, William Blake, the poet, and the Romantic movement, against this kind of new mechanical, machine-like universe that Newton apparently was proposing for science. And the irony there, I keep on stressing that Newton privately wasn't like that. He was a passionate Christian, but he seemed to have a hand in creating this colorless, mechanical universe, and people protested against it. Where is the sublime? Where is the beauty? Where is the truth, the meaning? And so that was the birth of the Romantic movement, not just in England, but in other parts of Europe as well. That's not really Orientalism. I know it's a different subject, but I just thought it was worth mentioning.
Yes, absolutely. Also, because if we think about the Romantic movement and this rationalism that through Newtonian physics stripped away any wonder, the Romantics would call it magic. That's not really the term we like to use, but that's what they like to use. Yeah. If you see now that we have the revolution of quantum physics, still people can't wonder. They just get scared. Subhanallah, that's strange. Yeah. Because quantum physics really in its basic core assumption puts back awe to matter. Even at the basics understanding, yet people are not able to have awe. And if you read the letters of the pioneers of quantum physics, they were terrified of their discoveries, not in wonder. So, and
of course, the Asherite theologian, the Kalam theologian, well, that sounds a bit like occasionalism. They bring this kind of theological interpretation to quantum mechanics. Yeah, well, we've been here before. So, anyway.
Yes.
So yeah, coming back to, I mean, one of the most popular works in Europe, translated into English, all sorts of languages, 100 Nights. Was it the Orientalist literary works? What was that book called? Something with 101 Nights in the West. That book, which I've not read. I must say, it's one of the the allegedly most famous Muslim books I've never looked at, but. I mean, what about Orientalist novels and paintings and things like that? What was their role in all of this, in trying to disseminate an Orientalist perspective?
Yes, this is actually an amazing topic, because it takes a direction which is a little bit different than the political, than the philosophical, than the historical, yet it complements it. If we see the way in which Western authors made paintings, let's start with paintings because it's easier, portraits in particular, of Muslim leaders. If we start from the 15th century, for example, with the amazing Bellini and the Venetian schools, then their portrait of the sultans with this very big turban, and they are so respectful, right, in their stance, and they demand authority and power.
Yes.
Go 200 years later, all this power is stripped off, and it just becomes like a collection book. You see, this is the image of a Turk, and this is the image of an Uzbek person, and it just becomes a collection of different people, of different costumes. And this is some of the popular prints at the time. But the actual Orientalist school of painting developed with colonies being very well established and being safe places for Westerners to travel. Artists travel to these lands, they try to sketch down everything they see, then they go back home and sell the paintings of this reality. But these paintings have to sell, so they have to include things that the Western public at the time would like. And so Orientalism painting becomes a way to sell, like, let's say, art which is more like erotic than actually related to what they were seeing in the Muslim world. And this is really...
To mention that there are many covers, as I said, to this book by Edward Said, Orientalism. Another cover I've got, which I won't show you, is of a painting, an Orientalist painting, I think from the 19th century, with a group of kind of Arab sheikhs sitting around in front of a naked boy, a naked youth, literally. I mean,
in a mosque. In a mosque.
In a mosque. I didn't realize.
If you look at the walls behind, it's a mosque,
really?
Which is
I didn't study
quite implausible that ever happened.
Exactly. That's my point. I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous. I mean, without going to the obvious reasons why it's not going to happen. But this represented for this Orientalist painter some kind of, I don't know, trope that he thought made sense of that world, of the East. Even though it's completely ridiculous from any realistic point of view, and that very well chosen for the book of a book on Orientalism, because even though it's not a good cover to have, but it nevertheless expresses that Orientalist misrepresentation of the West. Oh, the book I was thinking of, by the way, is 1001 Nights, a collection of Middle Eastern folk tales, looking at Wikipedia here, compiled in the Arabic language during the Islamic Golden Age, often known in English as the Arabian Nights. The first English translation was in 1706, actually. So very, very famous. Never read it. No, I don't know anyone who has. No one ever talks about it. But anyway, it's hugely important in the history of European literary understandings of Islam in the East.
Yes, and it creates, I believe, that is the most important books for the whole trope of the harem as a place of boredom and pleasure and this strange vibe that one gets from Orientalism. If you look at Orientalist paintings, people are always very bored, very inactive, and very sexualized. And this is a strange combination, and it goes back to the Kipling view, right? Half devil, half child. This is not a mature situation in which they're found. Not even when they're sexualized, it doesn't look mature. It looks like, what are they? They're not understanding. What are they doing? They're just on couches. They're just laying. And this is weird. And there is actually an example of an Italian princess in the 20th century. She's called Vittoria Alliata, who went to an actual harem and wrote a book and said, but you're crazy of thinking of the things that would happen here. It's just a normal place where women live and they read and they write and they're educated and they spend their day in much more interesting ways than aristocratic women at the time, because she was a princess. So she was quite an expert on boredom, because the aristocrats have quite an expertise on that. And she said, actually, it's much more interesting what happens over there. Unfortunately, I think this book is not found in any other language than Italian, and is still quite a rare book. But if somebody can find the words of Vittoria Alliata, who was also the first Italian translator of Tolkien, weirdly enough, so a strange character, but very interesting book.
Yeah. Well, just perhaps moving on, and one of the myths that I've certainly heard of, although less so these days, is this idea of, in the West, when it comes to Islam, closing the doors of ijtihad. So I guess the idea is a long, long time ago, any kind of creative, legal, Sharia, Islamic kind of engagement with contemporary issues was closed. The scholars no longer, it was decided long ago that the corpus of law was fixed, final, definitive, didn't need to be updated at all or engage with the world around it. And so the doors of ijtihad, which basically means reasoning, independent reasoning, were closed forever. And this has something to do with the backwardness of Islamic thought. I mean, on every level, that's just wrong. But why did this bizarre idea come about in the first place in the West? Because I've never seen anything like it in the Muslim world. It's just
Yes, this is a completely Western idea that then we feel like we have to defend against as if it was a real thing. But several authors have shown that there is no insidat babul ijtihad, which would be the Arabic term for that, in Arabic manuscripts of the time. So who closed it and which gate are we talking about? First of all, I'd like to say something about this. That is the door of ijtihad. And the word ijtihad sometimes is taken very much out of context by Orientalist and Islamic studies professors or academicians. Still now it's taken out. Because ijtihad usually was used by experts of fiqh. And it is one of the ways in which the jurist can work. One of his abilities is ijtihad. We do not talk about ijtihad about other things. For example, we wouldn't say that what Imam al-Ghazali in the Ihya Ulumuddin was doing was strictly ijtihad. It was more of a process of a mujaddid, right? Of a renovator, renewer. So ijtihad is a fiqh thing and in other disciplines as well. But Islam has this idea of tajdeed, of a renovation that the Prophet ﷺ promised us is every century. So how can we believe that the doors are closed if the Prophet said every century there will be a renewer of the faith? True. So this is, again, one of the circumstances in which in academia a word from the Islamic context is taken, given a different meaning, and then they try to find the culprits. And the culprits are either Imam al-Shafi'i or Imam al-Ghazali, the ones that try to create a system. But why is creating a system wrong in the Islamic world, but is always so right in the West? Because otherwise also Hegel would have closed the doors of reasoning, right? So many double standards there.
Yeah, I mean, most Western philosophers think they're creating the final definitive statement on philosophy, and that's it. We can all go home now because philosopher X, be he Hegel or Nietzsche or whatever, has given us the definitive philosophy of life. And of course, that's never the case. There's always someone, a disciple usually, comes along and overturns the master's thinking. And just to move on, if I may, there is a certain book which I know you've referenced, and I'll hold it up. It's been mentioned by many people. It's called A Culture of Ambiguity, an Alternative History of Islam, by a German scholar, Thomas Bauer. I'm not trying to pronounce his name. It's actually translated from the German, published bizarrely by Columbia University Press. Most of the books I've got here seem to be published by Columbia. And this has been very much praised by people like Abdul Hakim Murad at Cambridge and others. And I've read about a third of it. What is this concept of ambiguity? Why is this? Because the author is not, as far as I know, a Muslim, but he writes with great erudition and sensitivity in terms of the best of German scholarship. It doesn't appear to be particularly Orientalist. I don't know what you think, but why is his work significant in telling us about ambiguity in the history of Islam?
Yes, there are several of his works that I believe are really very important for Muslims, and even the ones that are still in German, unfortunately, I would advise getting them and reading them with Google Translate rather than not reading them, because they're so precious. In particular, there is one on the Islamische Mittelalter, so the medieval Islam, did it exist or not? And that's a very important topic, by the way, because thinking that Islam is the Middle Ages, then it requires an Enlightenment, right? And we're back to the Enlightenment again and again. But going back to Kultur der Ambiguität, it's an amazing book, one of my favorite books, really, of Islamic studies. However, there is this word ambiguity that he uses, which in German makes perfect sense, but I think that in English, also in Italian, ambiguity has also a negative meaning, right?
I mean, it's not very clear. It's sort of, and that's not necessarily a good thing.
I think that's perhaps a better word could have been used. I don't know, but ambiguität would be multifold openness rather than a univocal way, the opposite of that. So Islam is the culture that leaves open unless there is a reason to close them. And he makes amazing examples. For example, the readings of the Quran. We have 10 readings, but we only have 10 readings. The scholars said, you can read the Quran however you like, as long as it connects back to a silsila, to an isnad. So the idea is always there is absolute freedom as long as it is motivated by something. Like the food, right? Everything is halal unless there is a good reason for proving it is haram. And he makes a case that actually Islam has always tolerated ways of understanding which were mutually incompatible. but understood at a higher level they could have been. So it's a group.
Sorry, just a point of that Bauer, is it, how's his name, his surname, is it Bauer or Boer? How do you?
Bauer.
Bauer. Okay, I wasn't mispronouncing it. He just talked about modernity, by which means West, I suppose, and our fetish for clarity and black and white and yes and no. This idea of ambiguity, whatever the is, really sits very uncomfortable with this kind of quasi-scientific need for certainty and one right answer. We can't tolerate this kind of ambiguity, which seems to be part of the DNA of Islam historically, and also how that Western mindset has affected Muslim mindsets now as well. That we also require one answer to what does this verse say, definitively, clearly, unambiguously, in its uniform sense. There's no sense of where it could mean several different things, but it's affected the Muslim mentality to some extent as well. He does point that out, I think.
Yes, but you know what? It fits very well, this mentality, post-modernity, because people nowadays do not have, well, people nowadays are complicated, right? And I don't want to enter too much into the psychology, but on the one hand, they still believe many Newtonian ideas for science. Science is the ultimate layer of truth, yet do what makes you feel good. Do whatever you want. There is no absolute goodness. There is no absolute anything. Right. So a culture of ambiguity could be a middle lane between these things and bring back to reason the fact that post-contemporary self is shattered between needing to believe in something, namely science, without understanding it, and understanding that we cannot live of just one answer. And we as Muslims, we are making the mistake that we are focusing so much on things like what is the exact centimeter of cotton a woman has to put until the wrist, is the wrist included, excluded, to women that have converted since one day, right? And we put to them this type of content. No. Before, we should put to them the variety and the openness of our intellectual tradition, for them to develop love, attachment, understanding, and then we go into details because the Sharia is still there for a reason, right? And it has to be followed, but with an understanding.
Yeah, no, this is absolutely extraordinary. And as I say, many Western Muslim academics have praised this book, Tim Winter at Cambridge and others as well. So I do recommend it. It's a translation from the German. I didn't realize there were other works also that were worth looking at too. I mean, he's not a Muslim, is he? Or is he a bit like Goethe? Is he perhaps privately sympathetic?
I don't know. I don't know him personally, but what he's writing is really what I would be writing if I had more knowledge. So I don't know. SubhanAllah, it's very strange. It's very strange.
Yeah,
may Allah guide him if he's not, but really, he seems an amazing person.
There's a certain other very well-known Western scholar, I'm not going to say who it is, who I've been told indirectly is actually a Muslim, although he's publicly not a Muslim. So I think Tim Winter called them submarines.
Also Hollebeck, right? But with a different exception.
Yeah. So I think who knows, he could be a submarine as well. So this is extremely interesting. So in terms of the Enlightenment heritage, what it bequeathed to the world, to us, Muslims, indeed everyone, must feel very ambivalent. They were not ambiguous, ambivalent. In other words, maybe this, maybe that. We're not quite sure, how we feel about it. But is there anything at all that a Muslim, do you think, can take away from the Enlightenment in a positive way, or is it purely an internal European sort of counter-religious, anti-religious, counter-medieval movement that fetishized reason and a positivist understanding of science, and thus it's not really compatible with the Islamic worldview, which is much more nuanced and really on a different track altogether? I mean, is there anything we can take away from the Enlightenment project, or is it just really a European thing?
That's a great question, because many times in my travels, I meet, very often this happens with Arabs, people that tell me, oh, but you Europeans, through the Enlightenment, you broke the shackles and it's really positive. We should also have this. There are books that really call for reformation of Islam in terms that look very much like the Enlightenment. And I think, and this is still why the Bauer book about the Middle Ages is very important, we cannot use categories. of Western world to the Islamic one. It just doesn't work. Periodization, movements, ideas. Of course, Islam is not completely impermeable. We have seen that with Greek thought. We have seen that even with Indian thought, with poetry, with Persian thought. But it cannot include something that doesn't work with its own system, and which is completely at odds. And I think that Enlightenment is completely at odds with the way Islam not only values reason, not only sees religion, but lives in the world, sees perception itself. There are many ways to know in Islam. And at the end, all these movements are epistemologies at the end, right, of the story. And so the epistemology of Islam, and here there would be people like Naqib al-Attas, who have talked about in the best terms for nowadays, are not compatible with the epistemology of the Enlightenment. And one last thing I'd like to say is 2 suggestions of books.
Oh, yes.
To understand that this phenomenon is not over. So it's not like this podcast is about, oh, well, we like the 18th century, me and Paul, it's our favorite time in history. We just want to talk about it. But it has to do with nowadays. And I believe Muslims, by understanding the roots of the Enlightenment and Orientalism, can understand today better. The first is book Muslim in Western Imagination by Sophia Rose Arjana. And this is by an Oxford University Press.
Oh, I've not come across this before. Sophia Rose Arjana. Okay. Well,
yes.
Where did she teach?
Oxford University Press. And
where is she? Is she part of an
in the United States?
Okay.
Colombia.
Oh, no, again, Colombia takes the world. Amazing.
We should tag them in the video. Amazing. And this book is very important because it talks about a process which has happened in Western imagination. Imagination is another way of knowing, which has not been studied a lot, and we don't pay enough attention to imagination. But how did Middle Ages people imagine Muslim to be scary, strange? And she talks about the process of monsterification, which starts from the Middle Ages. Monsterification, yeah.
Wow, that's a good term. I remember that.
And she even shows some manuscripts, for example, in which we have like Salahuddin al-Ayyubi was painted with a blue face and a snake coming out his mouth. And this, she says, and this book has a very strong political argument, I love it, that this directly binds to the humanized bodies in, for example, Guantanamo Bay. If you think about it, how dehumanized Muslim, in particular men bodies, have become through this process. This is an amazing book. Another book.
And the Palestinians, I mean,
absolutely.
It's so obvious that Palestinian lives, Arab lives, brown lives are not worth what Israeli/white lives are. White lives are. It's such an obvious thing that the West would not tolerate at all what's going on if these were white people. We see this in Ukraine, of course, where we support our white European brothers or whatever. So the racial solidarity, the racial white supremacist undertones are ever present in our contemporary news. I think the way we treat
they are unconscious, and we as Muslims have to bring them to light, because even when the Ukraine war happened in my small town, our local newspaper said we have to welcome them because they are like us. And we had Syria happening a couple of years before, and I was flabbergasted, but I know they didn't mean it. They didn't understand the roots of what they were saying. They really were seeing these people like them, and they were seeing the other people unlike them. And this is something which, as Muslim, we should be in the first line, academically, intellectually, to fight with all the tools we have. And the second book I'd like to recommend is The New Orientalist.
Okay.
This is an amazing book.
Was it postmodern? Sorry, can you read the subtitle on the cover there? I can't quite read it.
Postmodern Representation of Islam from Foucault to Baudrillard. And this is by Ian Almond. And
dare I ask where he teaches? No.
At the Freie Universität of Berlin.
Oh, what a relief! Not Columbia.
Not Columbia. Yes.
Oh, that looks really juicy. Actually, I must get that one.
This is amazing because it's a book that takes key figures of the contemporary Western understanding and shows how their understanding of Islam is still Orientalist. Some people you would never, ever expect, for example, Borges, for example, Slavoj Žižek, for example, Foucault, and really completely suggest this reading as well.
Wow, Zizek, even he comes under criticism because
yeah, Zizek, which I have here in this book, Welcome in the Desert of the Real. I have the Italian translation here. He talks about the Iraq War. So we're going back. It's a bit of an older book. He never mentioned Islam once, ever. He just talks about there is an issue. We had so many victims, collateral victims. All right, the problem is America. So he just focuses to understand America, the American system, American politics. And then there is Iraq, which is the actual topic, which is being bombarded and not a care. And in the Ian Almond chapter, this is shown. And of course, Zizek is a neo-Hegelian, right? Yes. And post-Lacanian as well. So, hey, quite a bit of stuff.
I was hoping he would be idiosyncratic enough and brilliant enough to have transcended those, but you're no.
Not yet. Not yet.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Oh, there's the two books. Oh, fantastic! You know, I'll put those in the links below, and I will, of course, buy them as well because I didn't know about them. Thank you so much for those recommendations. Gosh,
I'm glad I can suggest something new.
No, indeed, I'm always on the outlook for fresh works like that. So. Perhaps is a great place to close on exactly 1 hour. Thank you so much, Dr. Francesca, for your time, your expertise. There's so much more, inshallah, that we will talk about in future podcasts. Very much want to share your extraordinary knowledge, your breadth of knowledge, your encyclopedic interest in so many different areas. I mean, you've got a PhD in systemic neuroscience, I mean, which hasn't really come out in anything you've said so far.
We should do that because that's
really absolutely. And then you got a diploma in Islamic psychology, another aspect, not unrelated, but nevertheless a distinct field. We could talk about Islamic psychology and the nature of being Muslim in today's world and identity and all that. And this your latest book, Italian Islam Manifesto, that sounds very interesting as well. We're always obsessing about what's going on in America, or perhaps to less extent in the UK. We need to look at what's going on in other very important countries in Europe, like obviously Italy. Anyways, much more, inshallah, we will discuss in future podcasts. Thank you so much, Dr. Francesca, for your time. You're absolutely amazing. And yep.
So wish you a great day.
And you too. Assalamu alaikum to you.
Wa alaikum salam.